Hi, this is Jacob Damrow, and today I'm going to be discussing the evolutionary history and the significance of THC. This is an important topic because as the conversation of marijuana legalization becomes more mainstream, it becomes increasingly necessary to educate ourselves on the facts surrounding THC and cannabis. So, what is THC? THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol, which can refer to several different isomers. As discussed in previous classes, like BIOL208, isomers are molecules made up of the same constituent atoms connected in different ways. However, when discussing THC, it is most common for this term to refer specifically to the trans-delta-9 isomer of THC, which is one of the 113 different cannabinoids that have been found in cannabis. This isomer is important because it is the psychoactive component in cannabis, meaning it's responsible for the high people feel when smoking or consuming marijuana. The structure of a THC molecule can be seen at the bottom of this slide in Figure 1. It shows us that THC is a polycyclic hydrocarbon with one aromatic ring that contains an alcohol, ether, and several alkyl functional groups that are substituted onto the polycyclic rings. Since structure equals function, it's this configuration that's the source of the effects of THC. In the last slide, I referenced the plant containing THC using different names, marijuana and cannabis. But what is the correct name, and is there a difference? Well, colloquially, society tends to refer to these plants as marijuana or weed. Those are the most common, but there's a lot of different names. However, the correct scientific nomenclature that best represents the phylogenetic background would be the term cannabis. This is because the term refers to the specific genus of the species, which belongs to the Cannabaceae, I believe, family, along with hops and hackberries. This indicates that hops and hackberries are the most closely related organisms to cannabis. It is fairly common knowledge that cannabis is a plant. As such, it would also be correct then to assume it belongs to the kingdom Plantae. Additional information on the classification of cannabis, such as the phyla, or phylum, the phylum, class, and order, can be seen on this slide in bold. In terms of the number of species that are included in the cannabis genus, there is not actually a definite consensus, as the topic is highly disputed within the scientific community. Some argue that there are 3 species, seen here as Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. Some say there are only 2 species, and that and that Cannabis ruderalis should be categorized as a subspecies of Cannabis sativa. Likewise, some argue that both Cannabis indica and ruderalis can be classified as a subspecies of indica, and that there's only one actual species of cannabis. Here are 2 possible phylogenetic trees showing the evolutionary history of different species of cannabis and other related species. As I mentioned previously, the number of species within the cannabis genus is widely debated. So Figure 2 shows an example from a source that supported the 2 species argument, whereas Figure 3 shows a source who supports the 3 species argument. However, that source also does, or you can see they focus mainly on indica and cannabis. Lastly, in Figure 4, we can see the phenotypical variation between different types of cannabis, which supports the idea that there are, in fact, 3 distinct species. The sativa can be seen to have much longer and thinner leaves and to be much taller than the other species. Indica can be identified by its intermediate stature, as well as by its very broad leaves that make the plants look much fuller than the other 2. Lastly, ruderalis can be seen to be incredibly small with much smaller leaves. It is also relevant to note that ruderalis has been found to contain less THC than the other species. Because it is still federally illegal, data on cannabis and THC is sparse, and that is especially true regarding information on the adaptive and evolutionary purpose of THC. It is mostly unknown why THC evolved in cannabis and what benefit the compound provided the plant in terms of its fitness. However, one study has found that THC has high UVB absorbance properties, which has led several researchers to theorize that this trait evolved in the cannabis species to help protect them from harmful UV radiation from sun exposure. Another important note is that while there are a few plants that have been found to contain other cannabinoids, THC is unique to the cannabis genus. There's no other species that contain THC except the species in the cannabis genus. Since only the cannabis genus has evolved this trait, it can be inferred that the evolution of THC is a monophyletic trait. And that can actually be seen by going back and re-examining those phylogenetic trees from figures 2 and 3 earlier in the presentation. These ones. As you can see here, the cannabis species are all in their own clade, are one clade together, rather, with a common ancestor shared only by them. And since all of these species evolved to contain THC, it can be assumed, or I guess it can be stated rather, that this trait was derived from that common ancestor. So because you have the trait and it's ancestrally derived and only present in the descendants of that common ancestor, and it's present in all of them, it can therefore be stated that the evolution of THC can be categorized as a monophyletic synapomorphy. The role of cannabis in the environment is hard to determine currently, as the criminalization of cannabis has caused it to be eliminated from a large portion of its natural habitat, which originally encompassed Central Asia, present-day Iran, and parts of Western Europe. It's now mostly found in agricultural settings, both legal and illegal. There's an exception for wild cannabis growing in some parts of America and Europe currently. What we do know about the ecological function in the environment is that as members of the Plantae kingdom, species of cannabis are photosynthetic autotrophs, meaning they use photosynthesis to create adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is energy. And they do that directly from the energy obtained from the sun. We also know that in addition to human consumption, there are documented cases of heterotrophic fauna, such as deer and mice, consuming agricultural and wild cannabis. This information has allowed researchers to conclude that cannabis ecologically functions as a primary producer. While there isn't much information about the depth and role played in the ecosystem because of criminalization, it has had a massive impact on society and of the culture of society, rather, in respect to its significance. While still heavily criminalized, there has been an increasing trend of marijuana legalization and decriminalization efforts by individual states as well as globally. For this reason, examples of references to cannabis and even different species of cannabis have skyrocketed, specific as both cannabis in general and specific references to sativa and indica. And they can all be found in most forms of media. In most forms of media that includes television shows such as Amazon Prime's Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, major Hollywood blockbusters such as the comedy Step Brothers, an extraordinary amount of art and clothing featuring things such as depictions of cannabis leaves, and especially music, such as from bands like the Grateful Dead, promoting the use of it. The number of examples is almost virtually endless at this point. It has become almost completely ingrained within American and global culture. In addition to its influence in the media, cannabis has other uses that have impacted human culture, such as the drug-related use of THC for cannabis known as hemp, which can be defined by the U.S. Farm Bill as seen in this slide. Because of its fibrous nature, hemp makes a great environmentally friendly alternative to paper, which is very significant because paper makes up the highest percentage of waste thrown in landfills. In addition to its cultural significance, use of cannabis has been associated with significant significant health effects. While we do not have a complete picture of the full scope of how THC and cannabis affect human health, there are a few key points of information that we do know from the few studies there are. At the current time, studies have shown that there are both positive and negative effects associated with cannabis use. The detrimental effects include increased likelihood of psychosis disorders such as paranoia, memory loss, decreased attention span, and increased difficulty with learning new concepts. Additionally, smoking and vaping, which are the two most popular methods of consumption, have their own negative health effects associated with them. As with cigarettes, smoking and vaping damages the lungs and decreases lung capacity. Vaping specifically also poses its own problematics because of the chemicals mixed into the THC, such as traces of heavy metal. Conversely, there are several cases to be made supporting the use of marijuana as a form of medical treatment for a plethora of different ailments such as chronic acute pain, Parkinson's, PTSD, some mental health disorders such as anxiety and major depression, and even pain experienced by cancer patients going through chemotherapy. Overall, there is a general consensus that while there are harmful effects, in certain circumstances, the harm may be outweighed by the benefits received by the patients, like in the cases I just mentioned. This is likely why it can be seen that medical marijuana use is actually supported by a majority of doctors and by a supermajority of citizens in the United States, which is indicated in the last point of this slide. So, to summarize, currently, it is believed that there are within a range of 1 to 3 different species/subspecies of cannabis that share a common ancestor. It kind of depends what scientist is being asked. Additionally, cannabis species are photosynthetic autotrophs that function as primary producers. Because THC has only been found in cannabis, and cannabis species share a common ancestor only amongst themselves, THC can also be categorized as a monophyletic synapomorphy. Additionally, cannabis use is both associated with negative health effects and is used as a successful treatment for some conditions. Finally, we talked about how there have not been a significant amount of research done on cannabis due to the criminalization and stigmatization around it. However, there is hope that there will be more studies as that's likely to change as public support continues to shift in favor of legalization of both medical and recreational use of marijuana, which has almost become completely bipartisan amongst the political spectrum. That is all for my presentation. Here's a list of the sources I used to make this. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something useful or interesting from this presentation that you'll take with you in the future, or for the future rather. Have a nice day. Oh, also as a final note to leave off on for grading purposes, I wanted to mention that the notes I will be submitting are the speaker notes. I didn't really take notes other than in here. I believe that should be acceptable. They're just in the speaker notes section of this PowerPoint document that I will submit. Thank you.